June 4, 1944, Captain Daniel Gallery stood on the bridge of USS Guadalcanal watching depth charges explode around a German U-boat that had just surfaced 700 yards away. Gallery was a 42-year-old naval aviator from Chicago, a man who loved breaking rules and hated following doctrine. He had spent 2 years hunting U-boats in the Atlantic. Now he had one on the surface, crippled, crew, abandoning ship. Standard procedure was to sink it. Gallery had a different idea. He wanted to capture it. Gallery grabbed the radio handset and transmitted an order that no American commander had given in 130 years. Away all boarding parties. Within minutes, sailors from USS Pillsbury, a destroyer escort, were rowing toward the surfaced U-boat in a small boat while German sailors jumped into the ocean to escape. The Americans were going to board an enemy warship in combat, something that hadn't happened since the War of 1812. If they succeeded, it would be the greatest intelligence coup of the Atlantic War. If they failed, they would die inside a sinking submarine in the middle of the ocean. The submarine was U-505, a Type YNC U-boat that had been hunting Allied shipping for 2 years. Her crew of 59 men had no idea they were about to become prisoners on their own boat. They had scuttled the submarine, opened valves to flood her and send her to the bottom. They thought she would sink in minutes. They abandoned ship, expecting to be picked up as prisoners while their boat took its secrets to the ocean floor. They were wrong. U-505 didn't sink. American sailors boarded her, stopped the flooding, and captured the submarine intact with all its codebooks, cipher machines, and intelligence materials. It was the only German U-boat captured by American forces during World War II, and it changed the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was the longest continuous military campaign of World War II, running from September 1939 to May 1945. German U-boats hunted Allied convoys, trying to cut Britain off from American supplies. Over 3,500 merchant ships were sunk, 72,200 Allied sailors died. The Germans lost 783 U-boats and approximately 30,000 submariners, a 75% casualty rate, the highest of any military branch in any nation during the war. By 1944, the tide had turned. Allied forces were winning the U-boat war through better tactics, improved technology, and, critically, intelligence. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had cracked the German Enigma cipher machine, allowing Allied forces to read encrypted U-boat communications. This intelligence, codenamed Ultra, was the most closely guarded secret of the war. The Allies knew where U-boats were operating, where they were going, and what orders they had received. Convoys were routed around known U-boat positions. Hunter-killer groups were dispatched to hunt submarines whose locations had been revealed by decrypted messages. But the Germans kept modifying Enigma, adding complexity, changing procedures. Every captured codebook, every recovered cipher machine, every piece of intelligence material helped British codebreakers stay ahead of German changes. Capturing a U-boat intact would be an intelligence windfall. Current codebooks, the latest Enigma machine settings, acoustic torpedo manuals, mine warfare documents, everything the codebreakers needed to maintain their advantage. The problem was that U-boats didn't surrender. When a submarine was damaged beyond the ability to dive, the crew scuttled her and abandoned ship. Scuttling was automatic. Open the seacocks, let the ocean flood in, ensure the boat sinks before the enemy can board. No U-boat had been captured intact by any Allied force. The Germans were too disciplined, too well trained. They followed procedure. They destroyed their boats rather than let them fall into enemy hands. Captain Daniel Gallery thought that was nonsense. Gallery was an unconventional officer who believed rules were suggestions. He had read reports of U-boats surfacing after depth charge attacks. He knew they could be forced to the surface. He figured if one surfaced close enough and fast enough, a boarding party could get aboard before the scuttling valves flooded the boat. It was theoretically possible. Nobody had tried it because it was insane. You don't board an enemy submarine in the middle of combat. Gallery wanted to try anyway. Captain Gallery commanded Task Group 22.3, a hunter-killer group built around the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. The task group included 5 destroyer escorts: USS Pillsbury, USS Pope, USS Flaherty, USS Chatelain, and USS Jenks. Their mission was to hunt U-boats in the central Atlantic, an area southwest of the Azores where German submarines operated on their way to and from American waters. Gallery was obsessed with capturing a U-boat. He studied U-boat construction, learning where the scuttling valves were located and how long it took to flood a submarine. He trained boarding parties on all 5 destroyer escorts, drilling them on how to row fast, climb onto a submarine's deck, get down the hatch, and find the valves before the boat sank. His officers thought he was crazy. Boarding parties hadn't been used since the age of sail. Modern warfare didn't work that way. Gallery didn't care. He issued standing orders to all ships in his task group: if a U-boat surfaces, close immediately and prepare to board. Don't just sink it, capture it. The sailors trained skeptically, rowing whaleboats around the task group, practicing climbing onto mock-ups of submarine decks. Most assumed they would never actually do it. It was the captain's eccentric hobby. The task group deployed from Norfolk, Virginia in May 1944. Their patrol area was in the central Atlantic, roughly 150 miles west of the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of Africa. The area was a known U-boat transit route. German submarines heading to American waters or returning to France passed through this region. Gallery's task group would hunt them using a combination of escort carrier aircraft for long-range search and destroyer escorts with sonar for close-range detection. The tactic was effective. Guadalcanal's aircraft would spot U-boats on the surface or detect them with magnetic anomaly detectors. The destroyer escorts would race to the contact and attack with depth charges, forcing the submarine to surface or be crushed at depth. Once surfaced, the U-boat would be sunk with gunfire or torpedoes. Task Group 22.3 had already sunk several U-boats using this method. Gallery wanted to capture one instead. On June 4, 1944, the task group was operating approximately 150 miles west of Cape Verde. The sea was moderate, visibility good, weather clear. At 11:10 hours, one of Guadalcanal's TBM Avenger aircraft, piloted by Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David, detected a submarine contact using sonar buoys. The submarine was running submerged, heading south. David dropped smoke markers and radioed the position to USS Chatelain. USS Chatelain, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Dudley Knox, raced toward the contact at full speed. Chatelain was a Buckley-class destroyer escort, 306 feet long, armed with 3 3-inch guns, depth charges, and Hedgehog anti-submarine mortars. She was designed specifically for hunting U-boats, and her crew was experienced. Chatelain made sonar contact. The submarine was 800 yards ahead, depth approximately 400 feet, moving slowly. Knox ordered a Hedgehog attack. Hedgehog was a forward-throwing weapon that fired 24 small mortar projectiles in a circular pattern ahead of the attacking ship. The projectiles sank rapidly and exploded on contact with a submarine's hull. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at preset depths regardless of whether they hit anything, hedgehogs only exploded if they struck the target. The first hedgehog pattern missed. The U-boat was maneuvering, trying to evade. Knox ordered another attack run. Shattullin circled back, regained sonar contact, and fired a second hedgehog pattern. This time, the sonar operator heard an explosion. Direct hit. One of the projectiles had struck the submarine's hull. Below the surface, U-505 was in trouble. The submarine had been running submerged for several hours, trying to evade aircraft contacts. The hedgehog hit had ruptured a fuel tank and damaged the electric motors. The boat was taking on water. Chlorine gas from seawater mixing with battery acid was filling the control room. The diving planes were jammed. The submarine was losing depth control, sinking toward crushed depth. Capitan Lieutenant Harold Lange, commanding U-505, faced impossible choices. Stay submerged, and the boat would be crushed by water pressure or poisoned by chlorine gas. Surface and the boat would be destroyed by American gunfire. There were no good options. Lange ordered emergency surface. Blow all ballast tanks. Surface immediately. Get the crew out before the boat is destroyed. U-505 broke. The surface like a breaching whale, her bow rising at a steep angle, water cascading off her deck. She surfaced 700 yards from USS Shattullin and 500 yards from USS Pillsbury. Both destroyer escorts immediately opened fire with 3-inch guns and 20mm anti-aircraft cannons. Shells splashed around the submarine. Several struck the conning tower. The Germans on the bridge dove back inside the hatch. Inside U-505, Lange ordered abandon ship. He also ordered scuttling, open all seacocks, flood the boat, ensure she sinks before the Americans can board. The crew didn't need to be told twice. They had trained for this. Scuttling was automatic. Several sailors opened valves in the control room and engine rooms. Seawater began flooding in. The evacuation began. Men scrambled up the ladder, through the conning tower hatch, jumped into the ocean, and began swimming away from the boat. They expected U-505 to sink in less than 5 minutes. That was standard. Scuttled U-boats sank quickly. On USS Guadalcanal, Captain Gallery watched the U-boat surface and immediately grabbed the radio. This was his chance. The boat was on the surface. The crew was abandoning. If he could get a boarding party aboard fast enough, before the scuttling valves flooded the boat completely, he could capture it. Gallery transmitted the order, "Away all boarding parties." On USS Pillsbury, Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David heard Gallery's order and reacted instantly. David was a 24-year-old Naval Academy graduate, a destroyer officer who had trained with Gallery's boarding party drills. He thought the training was silly. Now he was being ordered to actually do it. Board an enemy submarine in combat. While it was sinking, David ordered the whaleboat lowered. 8 sailors climbed into the small boat. David, torpedo man's mate Arthur Nispel, radio man Stanley WWII, electrician's mate Wayne Pickle, and 4 others. They rowed frantically toward U-505, which was 500 yards away, sitting low in the water, clearly sinking. German sailors were swimming away from the boat in all directions. American ships were still firing, though the gunfire was slowing now that the submarine's crew was in the water. The whaleboat reached U-505 7 minutes after the submarine surfaced. The Germans had abandoned ship. Not a single enemy sailor was visible on deck. U-505 was a ghost ship, floating but sinking, abandoned but still intact. David grabbed the submarine's deck and pulled himself out of the whaleboat. The other Americans followed. They were now standing on an enemy warship in the middle of combat. Nobody in the U.S. Navy had done this since 1812. The submarine's deck was slippery, covered with oil and water. The conning tower hatch was open. David looked down into the dark opening. Water was sloshing inside. The scuttling valves were open, and the boat was flooding. He could hear machinery running, alarms blaring, and nothing else. No voices, no movement. The Germans were gone. David made a decision. He went down the hatch. Inside, U-505 was chaos. The lights were flickering. Emergency alarms were screaming. Water was ankle-deep in the control room and rising. Papers and equipment were scattered everywhere. Valves were open, flooding the boat. David realized he had maybe 5 minutes before the submarine sank completely. He started yelling for his boarding party to come down. The first priority was stopping the flooding. David and Knispel searched for the scuttling valves. Neither man spoke German. They didn't know U-boat systems. They were working by logic and desperation. They found valves that were open and closed them. Some were the right valves, scuttling valves that were flooding the boat. Others were random valves that controlled ballast or fuel. They closed everything they could find. The water stopped rising, not immediately, but gradually. The flooding slowed. U-505 was still taking on water from holes and damaged fittings, but the deliberate scuttling had been stopped. The submarine wasn't sinking as fast. Maybe she could be saved. David sent WWII, the radio man, to find the radio room and grab anything that looked important. Dowyak found the radio room submerged in water, but managed to pull out codebooks wrapped in waterproof covers. He found cipher materials, documents, manuals. He grabbed everything and passed it up through the hatch. Meanwhile, Pikul, the electrician, was trying to stop the submarine's electric motors, which were still running and driving the boat in circles. He couldn't read the German labels on the controls. He started throwing switches randomly until the motors stopped. U-505 went dead in the water, no longer circling, just floating and slowly sinking. On the surface, Gallery was watching from Guadalcanal's bridge. He could see Americans on the submarine's deck passing materials up through the hatch. The boat was still afloat. It was working. They were actually capturing a U-boat. Gallery ordered USS Pillsbury to come alongside and pass over more men and equipment, pumps, engineers, damage control gear, whatever it took to keep that boat afloat. Over the next hour, more sailors boarded U-505. They brought portable pumps and started pumping water out of the flooded compartments. Engineers assessed the damage. The electric motors were intact. The diesel engines were undamaged. The pressure hull was solid, except for the Hedgehog hit, which had ruptured an external fuel tank but not penetrated the pressure hull. The submarine could be saved. She could even be sailed under her own power once the flooding was controlled and the engines restarted. U-505 was stable. The flooding was stopped. The water level inside was dropping as pumps worked. A skeleton crew of American sailors was aboard, enough to operate critical systems. Gallery faced a new problem: what to do with a captured German submarine 1,000 miles from the nearest friendly port, while operating in waters where other U-boats might be lurking. Gallery decided to tow U-505 to Bermuda, the nearest major Allied naval base. USS Guadalcanal couldn't tow. She was an aircraft carrier, too large and too valuable to risk towing a damaged submarine. The destroyer escorts were too small. Gallery ordered Guadalcanal's tugboat, a small auxiliary tug carried aboard the carrier for harbor work, to be launched and attached to U-505. The little tug, commanded by a chief petty officer, took the submarine under tow at 15 odd hours. The tow speed was 3 knots, walking speed. At that rate, it would take 2 weeks to reach Bermuda. Gallery ordered the task group to stay with U-505, screening her from potential U-boat attacks. Meanwhile, American sailors worked inside the submarine, pumping water, repairing systems, and critically, cataloging everything they found. What they found was an intelligence treasure. U-505 had been at sea for only a few days. Her codebooks were current. Her Enigma cipher machine was the latest model with up-to-date settings. Her torpedo manuals included information on acoustic torpedoes, a new weapon that the Allies knew little about. Her charts showed known Allied convoy routes and U-boat patrol areas. Her logs detailed recent operations, patrol routes, and contacts with other U-boats. The boarding party also found personal items that revealed the human side of submarine warfare. Letters from home, photographs of families, diaries. One sailor had been writing a letter to his wife when the submarine was attacked. The letter was unfinished, still on his bunk. The galley had food prepared for the next meal. The crew's quarters were cramped, dirty, smelling of diesel fuel and unwashed bodies. This was what life aboard a U-boat was like. Months of living in a steel tube, breathing recycled air, always one depth charge away from death. Gallery immediately classified everything. The capture of U-505 was top secret. If the Germans learned that a U-boat had been captured intact, they would change all Enigma settings, modify procedures, and the intelligence advantage would be lost. Gallery ordered radio silence. No transmissions mentioning the capture. Nothing sent in clear language. The task group would bring U-505 to Bermuda quietly, and the submarine would disappear into Allied intelligence custody. The tow was tense. The task group was operating in hostile waters. Other U-boats were in the area. If a German submarine stumbled across Task Group 22.3 towing U-505, they would immediately realize what had happened and report it. The intelligence coup would be compromised. Gallery ordered the task group to zigzag constantly, varying course to avoid potential submarine contacts. Aircraft from Guadalcanal flew continuous patrols, searching for U-boats that might threaten the group. On June 7th, 3 days into the tow, U-505's diesel engines were restarted. American engineers, working from manuals and trial and error, got the engines running. The submarine could now move under her own power. Gallery ordered the tug to cast off. U-505 would sail to Bermuda on her own diesels with an American crew. The little submarine, flying an American flag from her conning tower, became part of the task group formation, a captured German U-boat operating alongside American warships. The sight was surreal. U-505 looked exactly like the enemy submarines they had been hunting for 2 years. Her hull was dark gray. Her conning tower had German markings. She looked dangerous. American lookouts kept reporting her as an enemy contact until reminded that she was now on their side. It was psychologically disorienting to see a U-boat sailing in formation instead of being hunted and destroyed. On June 19, 1944, 15 days after her capture, U-505 entered Bermuda Harbor under tow from a larger tug. She was immediately moved to a secure dock, surrounded by armed guards and covered with tarps to hide her from curious eyes. Intelligence officers swarmed aboard and removed every document, codebook, machine, and piece of equipment. The submarine was stripped of anything useful. What remained was the hull and basic machinery. While U-505 was being towed to Bermuda, her 59 crewmen were already prisoners. They had been picked up from the water by American destroyer escorts within minutes of abandoning ship. Most were in shock. They expected their submarine to sink. They thought they were being rescued after their boat went to the bottom. Nobody told them otherwise. The Americans kept the German prisoners isolated from each other and from any other prisoners. Gallery's orders were explicit. These men must not learn that their submarine was captured. If they suspected U-505 was in Allied hands, they might communicate that information through prisoner networks back to Germany. The Germans had to believe their boat sank. The prisoners were taken to Bermuda and then to a special POW facility in Louisiana called Fort Ruston. This camp held German submarine crews in complete isolation from other prisoners. No contact with German POWs from other branches, no mail privileges, no Red Cross visits. The conditions weren't brutal, but the isolation was total. The U-505 crew spent the rest of the war not knowing what happened to their submarine. Captain Lieutenant Harold Lange, U-505's commander, was interrogated separately. American intelligence officers asked detailed questions about the submarine's systems, equipment, and recent operations. They avoided anything that might reveal the boat was captured. Lang assumed they had recovered documents from wreckage or from other captured U-boat crews. He answered honestly, believing his cooperation might help his crew receive better treatment. The isolation worked. None of the U-505 crew discovered that their submarine had been captured until after the war ended in May 1945. When they were finally told, most didn't believe it initially. They had seen the boat flooding, heard the scuttling valves open, watched water pour in. The submarine should have sunk within minutes. How could it possibly have been captured? American intelligence officers explained what happened. The boarding party got aboard fast enough to close the scuttling valves before the boat flooded completely. The submarine was towed to Bermuda and then to a secure facility in the United States, where it was studied extensively. Everything the Germans thought had gone to the bottom was now in Allied hands. Codebooks, cipher machines, technical manuals, everything. The crew's reactions varied. Some were angry, feeling they had failed in their duty to destroy the boat. Others were relieved, believing that capturing the submarine might have shortened the war and saved lives. Lang was devastated. He felt personally responsible. As commander, he should have ensured the scuttling was effective. He should have stayed aboard longer. He should have verified the boat was sinking before abandoning. His career had ended in failure. After the war, the U-505 crew was repatriated to Germany. Most returned to ordinary civilian lives. Lange became a successful businessman, but rarely spoke about U-505. When asked about the capture, he said simply that his crew had followed procedures, scuttled the boat, and abandoned as ordered. The fact that the Americans boarded fast enough to save her was not his crew's fault. It was good fortune on the American side and bad fortune on the German side. War was like that sometimes. The capture of U-505 gave Allied intelligence everything they needed to maintain their advantage in reading German naval communications. The codebooks were current through June 1944. The Enigma machine had settings that were valid for weeks. The manuals and documents provided context that helped codebreakers understand German procedures and tactics. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park received the materials within days of U-505's arrival in Bermuda. They immediately compared the captured codebooks with their existing intelligence. Everything matched. The Allies had been reading German codes correctly. But the captured materials filled in gaps and answered questions that had puzzled the codebreakers for months. More importantly, the capture of U-505 gave the Allies confidence that the Germans didn't know their codes were broken. If the Germans suspected Enigma was compromised, they would change everything immediately. The fact that U-505's codes matched current Allied intelligence meant the Germans still believed Enigma was secure. The Allies could continue reading German naval communications without fear of sudden changes. The technical intelligence was equally valuable. U-505 carried acoustic torpedoes, weapons that homed on the sound of a ship's propellers. The Allies knew these torpedoes existed, but had limited information on how they worked. Capturing intact acoustic torpedoes with technical manuals allowed Allied scientists to develop countermeasures. Ships began towing noise-making devices that decoyed acoustic torpedoes away from their intended targets. The countermeasures saved hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. U-505's charts revealed German knowledge of Allied convoy routes and patrol areas. Intelligence officers compared the German charts with actual convoy routes and discovered that the Germans had good but not perfect information. Some routes the Germans knew about, others they had only guessed. The Allies adjusted convoy routes accordingly, avoiding areas where German intelligence was accurate. The submarine's logs and communications files revealed German operational procedures, how U-boats coordinated attacks, how they reported contacts, how they received and interpreted orders. This information helped Allied anti-submarine forces predict U-boat behavior and develop better tactics for hunting them. But the greatest value of capturing U-505 wasn't any specific document or machine. It was the fact that the Germans never knew she was captured. For 11 months, from June 1944 to May 1945, the Germans continued using Enigma codes that the Allies could read, continued deploying acoustic torpedoes that Allied ships could defeat, and continued following procedures that Allied forces understood completely. The capture of U-505 helped shorten the Battle of the Atlantic and may have shortened the entire war. When World War II ended in May 1945, U-505 was at the Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in Maine, where she had been studied extensively by American engineers. The submarine was in excellent condition, fully operational, all systems functional. The Navy considered several options: scrap her for materials, use her for target practice, or keep her as a museum piece. Captain Gallery, who had been promoted to Rear Admiral by war's end, lobbied hard to preserve U-505 as a memorial. He argued that the submarine represented an important piece of naval history, the only German U-boat captured by American forces, the greatest intelligence coup of the Atlantic War. Gallery wanted U-505 preserved somewhere the public could see her and learn about submarine warfare. In 1954, Gallery succeeded. The submarine was donated to the Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago. Getting U-505 to Chicago required an extraordinary engineering effort. The submarine was towed from Portsmouth to Chicago via the St. Lawrence Seaway, then brought through the Great Lakes to Lake Michigan. On September 2, 1954, U-505 was hauled onto the museum grounds and placed on permanent display. The submarine became one of the museum's most popular exhibits. Visitors could walk through U-505, see the cramped quarters where 59 men lived for months, examine the torpedoes and weapons, and understand what submarine warfare was actually like. For decades, the submarine sat outside, exposed to weather, slowly deteriorating. In 2004, the museum undertook a massive restoration project, building an underground exhibit hall where U-505 could be protected from the elements and displayed in a climate-controlled environment. Today, U-505 is the centerpiece of the museum's collection. Over 500,000 people tour the submarine each year. You can walk through the entire boat, control room, crew quarters, engine room, torpedo room. You can see the Enigma machine that was captured aboard. You can read the stories of the American boarding party and the German crew. The submarine is exactly as she was in 1944, preserved as a memorial to both sides of the Battle of the Atlantic. Captain Daniel Gallery retired from the Navy in 1960 as a Rear Admiral. He wrote several books about his experiences, including 20 Million Tons Under the Sea, which told the story of U-505's capture. Gallery remained proud of the operation for the rest of his life, considering it his greatest accomplishment. He attended ceremonies at the Museum of Science and Industry regularly and spoke to visitors about the capture. He died in 1977 at age 75. Lieutenant Junior Grade Albert David, who led the boarding party, was awarded the Medal of Honor for his actions on June 4, 1944. The citation called his boarding of U-505 one of the most daring acts in naval history. David was the first U.S. Navy officer to receive the Medal of Honor in the Atlantic Theater. He remained in the Navy after the war, eventually retiring as a captain. He died in 1945 in a plane crash, a training accident that killed him just months after receiving the Medal of Honor. The other members of the boarding party received Navy Crosses or Silver Stars. All survived the war. Most returned to civilian life, though several stayed in the Navy. They remained in contact with each other for decades, attending reunions and ceremonies honoring U-505's capture. Captain Lieutenant Harold Lange, U-505's commander, returned to Germany after the war and never spoke publicly about the capture. He felt the loss of his submarine was a personal failure that haunted him for the rest of his life. In 1954, when he learned U-505 was being displayed in Chicago, he wrote a letter to the museum expressing mixed feelings, pride that his submarine was preserved, but sadness that she had been captured rather than destroyed as intended. In 1989, the Museum of Science and Industry invited surviving members of U-505's crew to visit Chicago and tour their old submarine. Several came, including some who hadn't seen the boat since abandoning her 45 years earlier. Walking through U-505 was emotional for these men. They remembered where they had slept, where they had stood during the attack, how they had felt when ordered to abandon ship. The submarine looked exactly as they remembered, frozen in time, a steel memorial to their war. The German crew members met the American boarding party members during these visits. Former enemies shook hands, shared stories, and became friends. They had all been young men doing their duty in a terrible war. Now they were old men remembering something that happened long ago. The animosity was gone. What remained was mutual respect between sailors who understood what the others had endured. The capture of U-505 taught the U.S. Navy several important lessons about boarding operations and intelligence gathering. First, unconventional tactics can work if properly prepared. Gallery's boarding party training was dismissed as eccentric by many officers. But when the opportunity arose, the training paid off. The sailors knew what to do. They rowed fast, boarded quickly, found the scuttling valves, and stopped the flooding. Without that training, U-505 would have sunk. Second, intelligence is often more valuable than destruction. Sinking U-505 would have been easier and safer, but capturing her provided intelligence that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. Sometimes the greater victory comes from preserving an enemy asset rather than destroying it. Third, operational security matters. Gallery's insistence on absolute secrecy about the capture ensured that the Germans never learned what happened. That secrecy preserved the intelligence advantage for 11 critical months. If the secret had leaked, the value would have been lost. Fourth, courage takes many forms. Albert David's boarding of U-505 required physical courage, climbing into an enemy submarine that was sinking, not knowing if German sailors were still aboard or if the boat would suddenly plunge to the bottom. But it also required moral courage, doing something unprecedented, something that might fail, something that other officers thought was crazy. The legacy of U-505 extends beyond military history. The submarine is a teaching tool. Students visit the Museum of Science and Industry and learn about World War II, submarine warfare, cryptography, and naval intelligence. They see what life was like for submariners, the cramped spaces, the crude facilities, the constant danger. They learn that history is made by real people making difficult decisions under pressure. U-505 also represents reconciliation. The submarine was built to destroy Allied shipping. She was commanded by men who fought for Nazi Germany. But today, she stands as a memorial to sailors on both sides, a reminder that even in war there can be humanity, respect, and eventually friendship between former enemies. If you found this story meaningful, please subscribe and share this video. These stories preserve lessons that matter: courage, innovation, the human cost of war, and the possibility of reconciliation. U-505 represents something unique in naval history. She is the only German U-boat captured by American forces during World War II. She provided intelligence that helped win the Battle of the Atlantic. She stands today as the most complete U-boat on display anywhere in the world. You can visit her in Chicago, walk through her compartments, and see exactly what submarine warfare was like. The capture happened because one unconventional captain refused to follow doctrine. Daniel Gallery believed capturing a U-boat was possible. His superiors thought he was crazy. He trained his men anyway. When the opportunity arose, they were ready. 7 minutes after U-505 surfaced, American sailors were aboard, stopping the flooding, saving the boat. It was improvisation, courage, and preparation coming together at exactly the right moment. The 59 German sailors who abandoned U-505 on June 4, 1944, believed they had done their duty. They scuttled the boat. They evacuated. They became prisoners, expecting their submarine was on the bottom. Learning years later that she had been captured was devastating for some, though others found peace in knowing the submarine survived and eventually became a memorial rather than just another wreck on the ocean floor. The American boarding party, 8 men in a small boat rowing toward a sinking enemy submarine, did something that hadn't been done in 130 years. They boarded an enemy warship in combat, risking their lives on the possibility that they could stop the flooding before the boat sank. Albert David climbed down that hatch, not knowing if German sailors were waiting with weapons, if the boat would suddenly plunge to the bottom, or if he would ever come back up. He went anyway because his captain ordered it, and because someone had to try. U-505 survived because people on both sides were human. The German crew followed their training, scuttled the boat, and evacuated. They didn't fight to the last man, didn't stay aboard to ensure the boat sank completely. They valued their lives more than the destruction of their submarine. The American boarding party stopped the flooding, pumped the water, and saved a boat that was built to kill them. They could have let it sink. They saved it instead. Today, U-505 rests in Chicago, 800 miles from the ocean, preserved in a climate-controlled exhibit hall beneath the Museum of Science and Industry. She is cleaned and maintained by museum staff who treat her with the respect she deserves. Over 500,000 people tour her every year. Children climb through the narrow passages. Veterans stand silently in the control room, remembering. Historians study her construction. Teachers use her as a classroom. Visit U-505 if you can. Stand in the control room where German sailors fought to save their sinking boat. See the torpedo room where 24 weapons waited to sink Allied ships. Walk through the cramped crew quarters where 59 men lived for months at a time. Touch the cold steel and remember that history is real, that war is terrible, and that even enemies can eventually become friends. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. We preserve these stories because they teach us that courage, ingenuity, and humanity matter, even in the darkest times. U-505 is still here, still teaching, still reminding us what happened 80 years ago when 7 sailors rowed a small boat toward a sinking submarine and changed naval history forever.